tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by Professor Gar Alperovitz. Professor Alperovitz is a historian, political economist, activist, and author. He's currently the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and a former guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. He's the author of several critically acclaimed books on the atomic bomb and atomic diplomacy, and his articles have appeared in leading American publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Nation magazine, and the Atlantic, and he's frequently featured guest on major cable news programs. After completing his PhD from Cambridge University, Professor Alperovitz served as a legislative director in both houses of Congress and as a special assistant in the State Department. He's also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is a founding principal of the Democracy Collaborative, a research institution focused on initiatives that promote the democratization of wealth. And most recently, he's the author of America Beyond Capitalism, a book that has been described as one of the most important books of the decade. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Gar Alperovitz.
Delighted to be here. Thanks,
Tom. To have you here with us to Conversations with Great Minds. America Beyond Capitalism. We're talking about systemic changes. What's the system and how does it get changed?
Well, there's a, basically in history, systems are defined by who owns the capital, who owns the wealth. Feudalism, a tiny elite held the land and the capital. In ordinary capitalism, it was small business owning the capital and defining the competitive capitalist system. State socialism or communism was the state owning the wealth. And we've got basically corporate-dominated capitalism, a system that's not very democratic because, we live in Washington here. The lobbyists are up there swarming and big money's there. Oh, yeah. But it's a form of capitalism that is increasingly understood, I think both on left and right, as not very democratic. So if you change the system, somebody's got to own that wealth. Not only the institutions, but the top 1% now has just about half of the investment capital. Think about that. 1% of a society owning just about half of all the investment capital. That's literally medieval, and I don't mean that rhetorically.
Well, I was going to, in fact, that's where my mind was going, was like what you're describing is basically a feudal state. It's basically kingdoms. These large corporations are functionally kingdoms with kings and lords and serfs, and they have no loyalty to individual nation states.
Not at all. And not only that, they will escape the nation when they want to, leaving behind empty factories. I've been out to Detroit recently. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a wasteland. They've just left it, or Cleveland, Ohio, or St. Louis. And secondly, I worked on the Hill, both sides, and the lobbying power, the amount of money that's up there moving legislation, and we've just passed this legislation to regulate banks, and there are 2,000 lobbyists up there rigging the rules and finding loopholes and
Dodd-Frank.
Yeah, and getting what they're having.
And it's still only, what, 20% implemented or something like that?
That's right. Hardly. But it's what is interesting is that you take the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street, they're upset about the 1% owning so much, but they're also upset about the democracy aspect. It's both economic power and economic pain, but also democratization. And in their General Assembly, they're trying to project a kind of different vision of democracy, and it is a vision, but I think it reflects what many people understand, that something's wrong in Washington, something's wrong with this, and that's what's really interesting about this time, when more and more people, left and right, have a sense, there's truly something fundamentally wrong in the country, and that's when you're beginning to talk about a systemic problem, not just who wins the next election, but really what's wrong at the heart of the system, the economic power base.
Right. Well, there was I think this sense all around the world in the 19th century, and in the 1860s, Karl Marx identified the problem, I think, fairly well actually in Das Kapital. His solution, you could argue, didn't work out, but there was a lot of social upheaval that came around that. And then you could argue also that in the 1930s, late 20s, early 1930s, here in the United States and around much of the rest of the world, the Great Depression, there was another crisis of the system. And yet it seems like the system always endures. It always reinvents itself. It always, this kind of neo-feudalism always comes back. How do we break that cycle? And what's at the core of that system, and what's the alternative to it?
Well, there are two questions, or really three. They're wonderful questions. And it's what drove me to write America Beyond Capitalism. I think that something at this point in history and I don't say this lightly, I think this is the most interesting and maybe most important period of our history, and for the following reasons, obviously oversimplified. The economy was decaying in the first quarter of the 20th century, up and down crisis, and World War I bailed out the economy. The economy began to decay in the 20s and then collapsed, and World War II solved the problem. And then in the Korean War, the Cold War, the Vietnam War in the third quarter of the century. And now, you know, military expenditures are high, absolutely, but they're declining to the 4% range. They're not sustaining the economy, and global pressures are undercutting us. So we're really up against, how do you manage the economy without war in a way?
We've been in a war economy for a century.
That's right. I think that's right. And that's like oversimplification. I wouldn't want, but
well, you
but
can
it's,
go back to after the Civil War. I mean, Reconstruction was hugely profitable.
Absolutely. And kept the system stabilized.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're in for a big crisis. The government was about 11% of the economy in 1929, and it's now about 30% roughly. So I don't think we're going to have a total collapse. But stagnation and decay and pain, and that's when people begin to think, is there a way to rebuild, to try something new over the long haul, trying to change the system, but in more of an evolutionary way than the traditional kind of classic crisis case. So it's a very interesting period. I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to easily bail us out of the stagnation pattern. We'll go up and down, maybe have a ripple, but the pain levels, I think, are going to continue, and that forces people to think, and I think to act differently and hopefully to change.
Well, you said, you know, the government's about 30% of our economy, and yet if you look at the economies of Canada, it's about 50%, 53%, right. I believe. Denmark, it's almost 60%. Most of the European countries are in the 50 to 60% range. And you could argue that if we simply took into what they consider the commons, things that should be the commons, arguably, the healthcare system and the higher education system, and maybe a few other pieces around the edge, but those at the core, our government would become maybe 40% of the economy, mm-hmm. and thus the fluctuations in the economy produced by changes in consumer spending would be less. Right. Wouldn't that stabilize our economy?
Yes, it's, you know, take almost any Keynesian economy, Paul Krugman being the most obvious, would say just what you've said. Right. Increase the expenditures, invest more, you will get more tax receipts later on to pay for this, and you can run deficits, and you could have a highly performing economy. The problem is politically.
I'm talking about nationalizing the commons, basically.
You are talking about that, and indeed, that way would work. But I think the politics of that, I think, is over.
The Koch brothers won't have anything to do with that.
Not only the Koch brothers, they won't play, but one of the things, and again, working in the House and Senate, mm-hmm. That set of policies really depended upon a liberal progressive coalition, and that depended upon a strong labor movement. Yeah. And labor movement's gone from about 34% of the labor force being organized. It's now at 11% and about 6% in the private sector, and declining. So the base of power for that way of solving the problem, sadly, I think is over. So there's either another way forward over the long haul, or I think we're in for real trouble and decay is what we're seeing.
Right. So what's that way forward?
Well, if systems are organized around who owns the capital, if that's where the power is, and if you don't like state socialism and you don't like corporate capitalism, obviously democratizing capital in some way is the critical idea behind it. Mm-hmm. And it's, in fact, if you think about it, there's a lot of that in America, just below the surface, and the press doesn't cover it. But 140 million Americans are members of co-ops and credit unions. Now that's
almost the size of the American workforce.
That's it, 40% and 40% of the society. So right. People they know something personally about a democratized part of the economy, and it's not very fancy, but it is one person, one vote. Or, for instance, there are now something like 14,000 worker-owned companies. I think the last number was 11,000 plus some others, mm-hmm. and about 13 million people involved in worker-owned companies. Now, that's another way to democratize who owns the wealth.
Aren't a lot of those, though, just kind of the old-fashioned ESOP? By old-fashioned, I mean, these are still recent, the last 30 right. years or so, but employee stock option plans where the employees own the company in as much as they own stock. Right. But they really have no say in the company.
Well, that's what's really interesting. Many of those there's some other one person, one vote co-ops as well. But what's interesting about the ESOP, and we can get technical about it, is it changes the ownership pattern and in most cases hasn't moved to democratization of decision making. Right. But there's a trend within the ESOP movement now. For instance, if you go to Ohio, which has been most studied, as people get more shares, and not surprisingly, they begin to want more action and want more decision-making. And you're also seeing some unionization. So I think, and again, I'm a historian, I think of decades going forward. I think we're going to see that whole movement of the ESOP even moving forward towards more democratization, more control, taking over, some of it unionized. There's a movement within, but it's a very interesting developmental pattern that the press hasn't been covering.
As a historian, do you see parallels between this and the Grange movement in the late 19th century? I mean, this was farmers getting together and saying, okay, the big banks in New York are gaming the system, the production companies are gaming the system. We need to organize ourselves into... These were not unions; these were cooperatives.
Cooperatives,
massive, and this was huge in the United States.
And I think there are parallels, and also parallels in the patterns of building up over time. When you think about the New Deal, for instance, most of the New Deal was developed in these small experiments in states around the country. I mean, Justice Brandeis called them the laboratories of democracy. Yeah. But they, in fact, state by state, were doing labor law, they were doing pension law, they were doing safety law. That built up those principles, small scale. When the moment came, they were just the same principles that became large scale at the national level. And I think that's the kind of way to think about these co-ops and worker-owned companies. There are 2,000 municipal utilities, another way to change and democratize. 25% of American electricity today, 25% is either, it's socialized if you like, municipal utilities or co-ops. Yeah. So there are things on the ground that when you actually dig it, and that's what America Beyond Capitalism attempted to do, just report on this, and then say, what does that look like? It doesn't look like corporate capitalism if you extend the principles, and it doesn't look like state socialism. It's an American model, something different under the sun, which I think is slowly emerging, and with intention, political intention, when there's politics, I think we can begin to promote and develop this in the way 14 states are considering state banks, public banks, like the bank in North Dakota. So you see this kind of movement beginning to take these principles to a new level. And again, if you look at it as a historian, the developmental pattern, the next couple decades, not the next election, that's where the groundwork, the foundation potentially gets laid. It's all positive in any case, but potentially developing principles that move to the national level at much larger scale at the right moment.
I was in Argentina in 2001, I think it was. It was right after they had basically told the IMF to take a leap, and months after. And in middle-class neighborhoods, you would see every other house, people had their furniture out in the front yard trying to sell it because, you know, they'd just been devastated. And a lot of the factories were closing. But people continued to show up for work, and they said, damn it, we're taking this factory back. And I understand that that has grown tremendously. I haven't been back since then. Is that
I think we're going to see some. We saw some of that in Chicago about 3 years ago. There was a takeover.
They window company.
Yes, and they said, we're going to stay, and finally they turned it around. But what's really interesting about Argentina, these are worker-owned companies. Many of them now, after the take it was called, many of them now are connected with the municipal ownership that the city of Buenos Aires provides contracts and procurement and buys from them to help stabilize these companies. Almost something very similar is now happening in Cleveland, where the big hospitals and the big universities are beginning to buy from worker-owned co-ops in that area. So you get a complex that's both worker-owned, but it has a community building idea and linked to something much more stable. And I think that's a really interesting model.
It is, and that way the worker-owned businesses know that they've got customers down the road they can budget out. We'll be back with more conversations with the great minds of Professor Gar Alperovitz in just a moment. Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. Tonight I am speaking with historian and political economist Gar Alperovitz. We've been talking about how change happens and how the system it has been put together in America, and kind of these cycles of history also that we're seeing in the United States. And you were talking about worker-owned cooperatives, some of the examples in Chicago. I think most people think, when you say worker-owned co-op, most people think my local health food store. Right. You know, or sometimes it's a garage, and there are a lot of those around the country. But these are fairly small scale things. How do you scale this up to reach the kind of mass necessary to create a stable flywheel part of a very complex and constantly moving economy?
Well, it's obviously, first, it's a development process over decades, but there's a really interesting experiment going on in Cleveland. We were talking about that before. And these are not your corner grocery store little co-ops. For instance, there's an industrial scale laundry there. It's about the greenest ecologically in the entire part of the Midwest there. It's in a LEED Gold certified structure. And it's a large scale system. There also is a solar installation company. These are all worker-owned. Solar installation company that is online to produce more solar installations than the entire state of Ohio already has. Wow. And there is another company, and they're putting about 2 online every year, I think is the pattern. Another company there is a greenhouse, solar heated greenhouse, in part solar heated. But again, not your corner grocery store. We're talking about 3 million heads of lettuce a year, that scale. Wow. So the idea is there's no reason these can't be scaled up. Worker ownership and worker participation, the studies show hands down, the productivity goes up, retention stays up, training costs go down because people are retained, just what you might expect if people have an ownership stake. And so I think we're going to see scaling, something like some of the things that we talked about in Spain, where they've gone really much larger on these same principles, and I suspect that's one of the directions, again, over the next decades, and particularly as other things are failing. That's really the context. The context is critical here. If everything was working fine, you wouldn't be seeing people developing new things, but things aren't working fine, so we're seeing just under the surface, all over the country, this kind of thing is beginning to pop up.
Well, and in Spain, several generations ago, this young priest showed up in Mondragon, in this town that was kind of falling apart in the Basque region of Spain, and said, let's put something together, and they've developed this amazing thing. We've both been there. You've spent a lot more time there and done a lot more research on it. I'm curious if you'd share with our viewers in particular, what is the Mondragon Cooperative, or Mondragon?
Mondragon, yes.
And why is it of consequence to us here in the United States? What can we learn from it? And what are the upsides and the downsides to it?
Well, Mondragon is fascinating, and it's becoming the model of interest around the world. And basically, it was started something like 55 years ago by a priest in that area. There were no jobs. And again, that's like Cleveland or Detroit, no jobs. And the question was, how do we build? And he started in a complex way, started with a school, actually, an engineering school, trying to train people. They are now 85,000 people working in about almost 80 different co-ops, but they're linked together with a financing system, they're linked together with training programs, and it is real worker participation that people make the decisions up and down the line. You'll find the shop clerk on the board of directors, and you'll find people making a real participatory strategy. And it's highly productive and very, very effective. And we're not talking about agricultural, just they have supermarkets, they have medical equipment, advanced research, they do high tech, they do construction, just like any major, it's a multinational corporation of that scale.
And a multi-billion dollar corporation.
Multi-billion dollar. So it's a model that tells you and what can be done. And it gives you really new ideas, because it's neither, and I think the essence of this book, America Beyond Capitalism, you don't have to have it either capitalism or socialism, the state socialism, the corporate capitalism. And it doesn't have to be half of this, hybrid. There are new things to do, and Mondragon is one of them. Mondragon has run into some problems, so it's not the full answer, because it's now run into the world market. It's so big. And the Chinese and the East Europeans are beginning to undercut them in some of their markets. So they're looking for market. They're actually over here now trying to help set up companies with the Steelworkers Union and others around the country.
Yeah, Leo Gerard has been.
Yes,
he's all over Mondragon. He loves the topic.
Yeah, it's happening here. They're coming here, but they're coming here really looking for markets for jobs and so forth.
Sure.
And if you go back to what I was saying about Buenos Aires or these hospitals, I think it's a more interesting model. The work in Cleveland has been based in part on Mondragon, but trying to use these institutions that are partly publicly funded, hospitals, they've got a lot of medical money in it, universities, to stabilize the market by purchasing some part of what they produce. Then you're not always up against the competition. You get more stability at the local level. So those kind of mixes of almost a planning system to help stabilize, but also be in competition so you don't get too much ahead of yourself without competition. Right. And those really interesting developments of this kind are happening.
I was in Madison a few months ago and talked to the people who run the Union Cab Company, and there's a manufacturing company there, Peninsula, no, Isthmus,
yes,
manufacturing, where tool and dies and actually all kinds of fancy stuff, worker-owned cooperatives. And one of the things that I discovered was that many states, most states in the United States, don't have a corporate charter provision in their state laws that would allow these kind of companies to even come into existence and you know, be recognized by the state as a legal entity and be appropriately taxed and regulated and all the things that are necessary for a company to exist. You write about B corporations, and that we only have 4 states in the country.
So far.
So what is a B corporation? Why only 4 states? And how many states even allow things like just basic, genuine worker-owned and run cooperatives?
I don't have the answer to the last question, but I do know that people have found wrinkles in the law where you can change the corporate charter and do it as a business or as an ESOP and find democratic participation, democratic control. And there are ways to develop within the legal structure, and in some states change the co-op laws. But so a B Corp is an example. We have it here in just over here in Maryland. Senator Jamie Raskin was behind doing that, very bright young senator. It's a very simple idea. If you are a corporate chief or you're on the board, your legal responsibility is to make profits for the shareholders. And if you deviate too far from that and try to do good things for the community, spending too much corporate money, you are legally subject to challenge by the stockholders.
We're talking about Dodge v. Ford back in the 30s in Michigan Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's the issue. So a B Corp, it's a different form of incorporation that is set up so that you are allowed to actually do things for the community. And then if someone invests in that kind of a B Corp, they know what they're getting into and they support you for that reason. And it takes the law, it just changes that wrinkle in the law and opens up ways for environmental or community contributions. It's very interesting.
You know, up until the mid-1890s, I think it was, whenever Ohio kicked out John Rockefeller and the charter-mongering era, it was about a 6 or 7 year period there where all the states were changing their corporate charter laws, and this massive competition on the East Coast that Delaware ended up winning, although New Jersey ended up with John Rockefeller. Right. Prior to that time, pretty much every state in the United States required that the first sentence of Articles of Incorporation be, this corporation is established to enhance or support or serve the community of fill in the blank, and to manufacture railroad cars. And that requirement that their first obligation be to serve the community was stripped out in virtually every state during that basically 1 decade window, and then over the next 30 or 40 years, every other state took it out. Couldn't we just put that back?
Well, we could.
Wouldn't there be one way to do it, and then say C Corps? You don't have a problem anymore?
Right. That is a possibility. What's happened, of course, has gone in the other direction to personhood, and really time to challenge that whole idea. Corporations initially, way back in the first part of the country and also in Britain, were chartered by the government to do a public purpose.
That's right.
The
Erie Canal Corporation was one of them.
Exactly, and all of the big corporations. There was no such thing, really, for all purposes, as a corporation just to make money. Right. It was an institution set up by the state and chartered to do economic activity for the good of the society, and you could make some money doing that, but it was very narrowly defined. We've gone a long way from that now, so that now they're people for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. And the railroads and Reconstruction, that was kind of the pivot point for all of that after the Civil War. So the Occupy Wall Street movement, it seems to me that there are some incredible parallels. I just discovered that there's a book about the Hoovervilles. We had all these Hoovervilles in the late 20s, early 30s, and the biggest one was in Seattle. The mayor of Seattle, or the mayor of that Hooverville in that city, was a fellow by the name of Jesse Jackson, and he wrote a book about the experience, which I'm trying to track down right now. Got pieces of it, and their philosophy and their behavior seemed really similar to the Occupy movement. I mean, they were occupying territory all over the country, and local governments would come in and knock them down, burn them out, kick them out. They'd come right back. Right. Do you see history repeating itself? Do you see the Occupy movement as something that might propel this forward, or is that just an interesting analogous parallel.
Well, I think what's interesting about the Occupy movement is that they have occupied as a way of raising consciousness, spectacular raising of consciousness. They've really cracked open a whole debate with just some kids sitting down.
Yeah.
But I think they're interested in new ideas, and where do we take it beyond that into politics, beyond the Hoovervilles, getting out in the communities, doing politics, building new institutions. I think that direction is part and parcel of where that's going to go, and hopefully it'll begin to take. We've had a great deal of interest in all of these models because it gives people something to hold on to and build forward with. Mm-hmm. So I think they're going to be very political as well as institution building.
If I'm curious, in the 2 minutes we have left here, your thoughts on how politicians, how are your ideas being received here on Capitol Hill or in the various states, whether it's the idea of state banks, you know, more of a micro level, or at the macro level, you know, just changing the fundamentals of capitalism?
Well, it's very interesting because it isn't bipartisan, but for instance, in the state of Indiana, the very conservative Republican treasurer is putting state money down in a way as deposits to lower interest rates for worker-owned companies. And over on the other side, Sherrod Brown has been toying with legislation to help develop worker co-ops. Right. So there's kind of an interesting thing. I don't think it hasn't shaken out yet. And of course, when we get to the larger level, when some of these banks, the Wall Street banks, I'm sure there's going to be a big fight. When the next big crisis comes, there's going to be demands to take them over, and that's going to be a big fight politically. But at the local level, in some areas, there's a lot of kind of coherence. You don't find the same kind of ideology in most local areas, particularly when there's a great deal of economic pain. And people are looking for answers, and that's what's very interesting about this period.
Is there any conversation about this on Capitol Hill?
There is some conversation. The co-op bill was introduced this week to foster co-ops. This is the year of the co-ops, the United Nations. There's this work that I think the ESOP Forum, the Rohrabacher, one of the most conservative members of Congress, is calling for ESOPs that are one person, one vote. So there's a very interesting, just under the surface, left-right kind of experimentation in this area that probably, again, as the pain deepens, people I think are going to be doing much more of this.
That's remarkable and important stuff. Professor Alperovitz, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
It's an honor to have you and
my pleasure.
To hear your thoughts. To watch this conversation again, as well as other conversations with great minds, check out our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com.